So I'd like to welcome everybody to our water supply and demand in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin webinar today. My name's Rebecca Pike. I'll be your chair for the session today, and I'm the program manager for irrigation with Agriculture Victoria, and I'm coming to you from the Echuca office. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that we're coming to you from today. I'm coming from the lands of the Yorta Yorta people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I would like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to the traditional owners of the lands that we're all dialing in from today. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on the 2025 update of the water supply and demand in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin report. We're here today to learn more about the recently released independent report by WSP updating estimates of water availability and perennial horticultural demand in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. So this report was released late last week, I believe, and is available on the Victorian Water Register website. So we've just popped that link to that report into the chat. So this report builds on the analysis released in 2019, 2020 and 2022. And today's session will involve firstly a presentation from Ben Williams and Rajiv Venkataraman from WSP on the report itself. And then we'll hand across to a presentation from James Brooks and Joe Banks from DEECA Water Resource Strategy Group, who will do a bit of a discussion on some of the trends. And then we're going to hold questions until after the two presentations, and then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions and answers at the end of the two presentations. So we've got a large number of participants for today's webinar. So we've decided to turn off the chat, the voice and the video function for all participants. So to put questions in for the Q&A session, I'd ask you to look along the bottom of the screen and use that Q&A function because that will be active. So if you've got any questions that pop up for you throughout the webinar, please go to the Q&A section and pop your questions in there. And also thank you to everybody or to those that put some questions in as part of the registration process. We've taken note of them and they'll be included in the list as well. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can, but we should have about 20 minutes at the end of the presentation section for a good question and answer session time. So now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben and Rajiv from WSP, who are going to provide us with the presentation on the update of the report. Take it away, Ben and Rajiv.
Thanks, Beck, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Williams, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you today from what is a very dark and wet Kaurna country in Adelaide. Before we kick off, I just wanted to thank my team who've done a fantastic job with this important analysis. Steph, Ellis, Duncan, and of course, Rajiv Venkataraman, who's joining me here today. I'd also like to thank all the very generous external contributors to this report who provided their data and expertise to help us. Now, for many of you, this is not the first time you've engaged with this piece of work, and you'll recognise Aether as the author of previous iterations. In case you're unaware, Aether was purchased by Ricardo PLC in 2023, and in a classic tale of the consulting world, just 2 years later, Ricardo was acquired by WSP. WSP is a global professional services firm applying engineering, advisory, and science-based expertise to the challenges that we face both locally and globally. Rajiv and I are pleased to be able to present on behalf of WSP the fourth iteration of our analysis of the supply and demand dynamics in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. Now, we've got quite a bit to get through today. First, we'll discuss the case for updating the analysis now. Then we'll talk through our methodology for estimating demand and supply. Next, we'll discuss the findings from the 2025 update, and then we'll talk about what effect Commonwealth buybacks might have on the analysis. Finally, we'll wrap it up with the key messages from the report. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is the fourth iteration of this report, which builds on the prior analyses and presents a more detailed picture of how supply and demand dynamics are developing in the southern Murray-Darling Basin. So why update it now? Well, it's been 3 years since the last report, and during that time, there's been several developments that have prompted a revisit of this analysis. Most importantly, has been the availability of new data. The data available has changed since the first report in this series, which relied heavily on ABS data. But the most recent Sunrise 21 report included new data on the areas planted to different crops in the Lower Murray. There's also been significant upheaval in commodity markets, particularly in wine grapes. Now, over the past 5 or 6 years, there's also been a number of well-documented inquiries that have raised the importance of water market information to market participants. Demand information in particular is one of the most challenging for market participants. Indeed, this remains challenging for governments also. Changes in demand and new developments over time, particularly in the wake of recent regulatory changes, including place of take approvals process and the management of intervalley trade. The reintroduction of buybacks as a water recovery tool has also introduced a new challenge for market participants to navigate. And all of this meant the timing was right to update the analysis from 2022 to provide some additional insights as to what all this means for the balance between supply and demand in the southern MDB. So at this point, I'll hand over to Rajiv to explain the methodology behind the analysis. Rajiv?
Thank you, Ben. Now let's first look at the way in which we calculated water availability. First, we examined the total water entitlement on issue using the latest data as of 2024-25, as you can see in the figure here. From this, we next subtracted the volume of water held, both for the environment and for urban use, to calculate the consumptive entitlement on issue for irrigators. Against this, we then applied how much water would be allocated to entitlements based on historic allocations across 5 weather scenarios. This ranged from wet conditions similar to 22-23 down to extreme dry conditions similar to the Millennium Drought in 2007-08. Lastly, we then added additional allocations that could be made available to the irrigation market, such as via trade from environmental water holders and water corporations. Now let us look at how we estimated water demand from permanent horticulture. First, we examined actual water usage as of 2024-25. This is the most recent water year for which complete and consistent data was available across all 3 states. It must be noted that 2024-25 was a relatively hot year, and so the usage would be slightly higher. This data was provided by state governments. Second, we looked at additional future water demand as existing croppings continue maturing. And this was inferred from changes in crop area data collected via aerial surveys. Third and last, we looked at extra water demand from future horticultural developments which could occur in the next 3 to 5 years. This data was collected from a range of industry stakeholders. It must be noted that this demand is not guaranteed to happen and is subject to significant uncertainty driven by broader economic and commodity-specific conditions. In this presentation, we will focus on the 2nd and 3rd level demand estimates, as this includes permanent plantings at full maturity. Now, just a note to further elaborate our approach to estimating future water demand from plantings yet to take place. We sourced this information in a similar fashion to the last report by engaging with a range of stakeholders across the southern Murray-Darling Basin. This included government departments, industry bodies, individual producers, as well as industry professionals. And the focus was on new plantings or removals that would have a reasonable chance of occurring in the next 3 to 5 years. As noted previously, just a reminder that this data then is subject to a high level of uncertainty and depends on a range of weather and economic conditions. So now, firstly, what does the data say about additional future water demand that will come online once existing plantings become fully mature? This chart here shows a breakdown of the data, with the right side showing what we saw in this report, with an extra 67 gigaliters of water demand yet to come. This is lower than the 146 gigaliters of extra demand we calculated from the previous report, which you can see here on the left. Now, what could be causing the slowdown? Firstly, almond plantings from the 2022 report have been continuing to mature. Their annual usage tends to plateau after the first few years. Secondly, declines have also been observed in table and wine grapes in the last few years, driven by a range of factors, including past export trade restrictions, low commodity prices, and inflation. Now, secondly, what does the data say about additional future water demand from new future plantings? This chart compares what we're projecting this time on the right in this report versus what we projected in the previous report, as you see here on the left. And as you can see from the right, projected demand into the next 3 to 5 years is lower than what we previously saw in the last report. Specifically, 87 gigaliters total in this report on the right, compared with 401 gigaliters on the left. And while previously we expected a 117 gigaliter growth in demand, water demand from grape plantings, this time we expect a 19 gigaliter reduction in water demand from these crops. The drivers in this reduction are similar to what was discussed previously. The wine grapes industry continues facing significant headwinds amidst low commodity prices, a structural oversupply of wine, and broader cost pressures. While interest in new almond plantings continue, rising interest rates, inflation, and relatively lower almond prices have cooled the enthusiasm with which investors approach these investments. I will now hand back to Ben here to start discussing the key findings for the 2025 update. Over to you.
Thanks, Rajiv. So when reading this report, it's important to note that the analysis is separated between the Lower Murray and the broader connected Murray. Our analysis assumes that trade between Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia is unrestricted. We've also assumed that there's no trade in from the Lower Darling and no trade into or out of the Murrumbidgee. When looking at the Lower Murray, we've also not considered any intervalley trade from above the Barmah Choke, nor from the Goulburn. Now, we understand that this is not what happens in reality. However, it removes a significant variable from the analysis. And once again, this is consistent with past reports. One interesting factor in this report was the very slight increase in supply originating from the irrigators' share of the Connections project, which totaled around 70 gigalitres. So, first up, we'll look at the results in the Lower Murray. As you can see here in blue, the demand from existing permanent horticulture at full maturity is around 1,200 gigalitres. Now, note that demand is static across all the climate scenarios. So we've not factored in any behavioural changes by irrigators, which of course is likely to occur when the allocation price reaches a particular threshold. We've now added in the estimated availability for Lower Murray entitlements under different climatic conditions in yellow. Now, it's important to note here that we haven't accounted for any groundwater availability. And as you can see, water availability varies substantially across the scenarios by up to 1,400 gigalitres. Now, the light blue bars here indicate the estimated volume of water in excess of permanent horticultural demand. A reminder here that we're looking at existing plantings at full maturity in the Lower Murray. So wet, average and dry scenarios have varying degrees of horticultural headroom. However, when conditions are moderately dry, think 2019-20 or even last year, the headroom is approximately 130 gigalitres in deficit. Now, the reality is intervalley trade is highly likely to be able to cover this deficit. But when we find ourselves in an extreme dry scenario, think 07-08, the deficit is much larger, exceeding 720 gigalitres. It's quite a sobering number, and the reality here is that this volume is highly unlikely to be available via intervalley trade. This is probably this is one of the most important parts of this analysis, and as it's based on existing plantings at full maturity. Okay, so what about projected future water demand in the Lower Murray at full maturity? So the projected increase in demand here is 45 gigalitres, which doesn't materially change the results. That is to say, wet, average and dry conditions, there's still some headroom. Under moderately dry conditions, the deficit is still likely to be met with intervalley trade. And the extreme dry scenario remains problematic with a deficit of more than 760 gigalitres. Now, what about the connected Murray? The dark blue bars on this chart represent demand from existing plantings at full maturity. The yellow lines are the estimated water availability under each scenario, excluding groundwater. The green lines on this chart show the estimates of water availability, including groundwater. Now, we include groundwater in the connected Murray because of its widespread availability across the region, whereas in the Lower Murray, access to groundwater is quite limited. The light blue bars represent the volume of horticultural headroom under each scenario. So the key takeaways from this chart are that across the connected Murray, there's surplus water under all scenarios except the extreme dry. However, in this scenario with groundwater included, there's ample water supply to cover existing plantings at full maturity. So still with connected Murray, let's look at projected future water demand at full maturity. The results here are pretty similar to the existing demand at full maturity that we just looked at. Headroom, including groundwater, under extreme dry scenarios is slightly reduced, but one point of note from this analysis is that under the extreme dry scenario, excluding groundwater, there is a deficit of almost 380 gigalitres. Now, this is significant insofar as it highlights that any additional permanent horticultural demand from above the Barmachoke or within the Goulburn will increase competition for allocations in dry years, which will further reduce the volume of water available to be transferred into the Lower Murray. Now, since the last report, the Commonwealth has implemented direct buybacks to recover water for environmental targets under the Basin Plan, including towards the 450 gigalitre target. This is probably the most consequential change in policy and water management during this time. One thing to keep in mind when discussing the Commonwealth targets is that these targets and the reported volumes towards them are measured in gigalitres per year, or the long-term diversion limit equivalent, or LTDLE. So with that in mind, all the figures on this slide are gigalitres per year, or LTDLE. Our challenge with this iteration of the report was to incorporate future water availability once the Commonwealth has finalised their water recovery. There's much that's unknown in this space, of course, and our buyback scenario was based on information published by the Commonwealth on water recovery efforts as at the 30th of June 2025. We note that there's likely to have been updates to these figures and plans since that time. But we had to make some assumptions for this section. So first, we've assumed that the Commonwealth intends to recover the full 450 gigalitres. Secondly, this will be recovered exclusively from the Southern Basin. We have, however, allowed for the over-recovered volumes from the Bridging the Gap target that have since been applied to the 450 target, some of which are in the Northern Basin. Thirdly, we've assumed that any future water recovery will be done proportionate to the existing Commonwealth environmental water holder portfolio. And finally, with this in mind, the additional volume of water to be recovered as at 30th of June 2025 was assumed to be 150 gigalitres LTDLE. So when we apply this volume to the Commonwealth's portfolio, the proportionate reduction in nominal volume is estimated to be 363 gigalitres. Now, this equates to around a 7 to 8% reduction in water availability in the Lower Murray. So what does that mean for our headroom analysis? This chart shows the base case water availability in 2024-25 in the Lower Murray, shown in the dark blue columns. The yellow line is demand from existing permanent horticultural plantings at full maturity. So let's see what the impact of buybacks could be on supply and headroom. Here in green, you can see that buybacks further tighten supply in the Lower Murray, moving the dry scenario into marginal headroom at just 35 gigalitres. The moderately dry scenario is now 250 gigalitres less than demand. Now, this is significant because it really begins to test the boundaries of intervalley trade, meaning that even with intervalley trade, there could be a shortfall in the Lower Murray. Now, just a reminder here that the demand line is existing plantings at full maturity. So, okay, what about the connected Murray? So in the blue columns here, we see the base case supply scenarios with the yellow line presenting the total demand for existing permanent plantings at full maturity in the connected Murray. When we add the green columns representing the buyback scenarios, we can see that under extreme dry conditions, supply is only 37 gigalitres more than demand from existing plantings at full maturity. This includes available groundwater. So what are the key messages from the 2025 update? The growth in permanent horticulture has slowed considerably. The wine grape sector is experiencing significant restructure, which is expected to result in a more than 10% decline in wine grape hectares, according to Grape and Wine Australia. Certainly in the short term, it's difficult to imagine much water being put out on inland wine grapes at $400 per meg. Economic power struggles between the US and China have so far benefited Australian ag, and with almond prices remaining healthy, it's likely investment in this sector will continue. Another sector to keep watching is olives, with a major development planned in the South Australian Riverland. And Rajiv, that's something we might need to add to our future analysis. All things considered, the takeaways from this report are that despite slower growth in horticultural development and the risk that water demand will outstrip available water remains very, very similar to that in the 2022 report. This report paints a slightly less concerning outlook than the 2022 report, which anticipated much greater growth than what eventually occurred. And with that in mind, the current analysis highlights what could happen rather than what will happen. Where horticultural headroom is marginal or in deficit, prices for allocated water will likely rise sharply. This will result in some changes at farm level. Once again, the analysis highlights the importance of intervalley trade and carryover as risk management tools for market participants, especially in Lower Murray. Now, we'll get to your questions soon, but before that, I'll hand over to James from DEECA.
Thank you, Ben. Hopefully you can all see the slide on the screen, or it should be appearing shortly. Also online with me today is Joe Banks. In this brief presentation, I'll be covering how the Victorian Government is supporting water market transparency, the framework for how water availability risks are managed in Victoria, and I'll also touch on delivery risks. What are they and what information is available to understand current risks? The Victorian Government is committed to supporting water market transparency to help water market participants make informed decisions. In addition to the latest water supply and demand update we've heard about today, recently published information includes updated analysis of long-term water market trends in Northern Victoria from 2001 to 2024. You can find these and other reports on the Victorian Water Register website, where you can also subscribe for the latest news updates. And on the next couple of slides, I'll touch briefly on some information that was recently made available that's relevant to today's discussion. For many years in Victoria, we've been monitoring and publishing information on irrigated crop area changes. And in recent years, this analysis has been expanded across the Lower Murray-Darling and Mid-Murray regions. The latest report, which is available on the MWA website, shows that changes in permanent plantings in the Lower Murray-Darling are occurring across Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia. while the main growth period in permanent plantings occurred at different times in each state. In Victoria, permanent plantings expanded earlier than in the other states. And as a result of this, estimated future water demands from existing plantings that are yet to mature are higher in New South Wales and South Australia, where permanent plantings have expanded relatively recently, noting, of course, the uncertainty of these figures. Together with the latest water supply and demand update, this analysis highlights that managing water availability is a shared challenge affecting all states, and we're committed to continuing to provide information like the water supply and demand update to help others understand this risk. Another piece of information that's been available recently relates to water buybacks. Since 2024, the Commonwealth Government has purchased water in Northern Victoria under both the Aboriginal Water Entitlement Program and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And we know from our work monitoring socio-economic impacts of Basin Plan implementation that untargeted Commonwealth water purchases have impacted water markets, alongside seasonal conditions, changing commodity production systems, and other factors. The Victorian Water Register website now includes information on recent Commonwealth purchases to support transparency and to keep Victorian communities informed about these purchases. The chart on the screen shows Commonwealth water purchases in Northern Victorian trading zones, indicated in green and in orange, since July 2024, and other transfers are indicated in blue. Between July 2024 and March of this year, 37 gigalitres of high reliability water shares and 20 gigalitres of low reliability water shares were transferred to the Australian Government across both programs. You can find further information on the Victorian Water Register website. While Victoria is providing information and other tools such as trade and carryover to help water users manage their water, all water users are ultimately responsible for managing their own water availability risks. And Victoria takes a zero-tolerance approach to detected or alleged water theft, which ensures the equity of access to limited water resources and protects water security for those who are doing the right thing. Penalties for the most serious offences have recently been increased and now exceed $1 million for companies and $230,000 for individuals. Looking ahead to water availability in 2026-2027, the Resource Manager recently published updated seasonal determination outlook on the 1st of April. Rainfall in February and March has had little impact on seasonal determinations for the upcoming year, and without further rainfall and an increase in stored volumes, opening allocations are likely to be low in the Murray, Goulburn, Campaspe, and Loddon systems. Drilling into the Murray system in 2026-2027, an opening allocation is forecast even under extreme dry conditions. However, under dry or extreme dry conditions, allocations may not reach 100%. And we saw this happen in the Goulburn system this year, where where high reliability allocations reached just 81%. You can find more information on the Northern Victoria Resource Manager's website, and a further updated outlook will be released in mid-May. I'll turn now to delivery risks. It's important to note that the report discussed today focuses on water allocations that could be made available for irrigation across a range of different climatic scenarios. While irrigators may have water available in their account, there has always been a risk during peak irrigation periods that river operators may not be able to deliver enough water to the Lower Murray to meet all demands. The risk of a shortfall, when water is unable to be delivered where and when it's needed, is increasing due to both changes in supply and demand in the system. And these changes include reduced flow capacity through the Barmah Narrows or Barmah Choke, less frequent access to water in the Menindee Lakes, increased environmental deliveries to South Australia over summer, changes in the timing and location of irrigation demands in the Lower Murray, and climate change. When a shortfall occurs, this may result in temporary rationing of water users in the affected reach to share the available water supply. I'll touch very briefly on how governments are responding to increasing delivery risks in the Murray before turning to what information is available to help understand current risks. Firstly, river operators actively manage the River Murray system to avoid shortfalls. And there is significant work being undertaken to date and still underway by Victoria and basin states to address delivery risks. In Victoria, this includes, for example, capping extraction share in the Lower Murray to protect existing delivery rights and updating our trade rules to ensure traded water can be delivered without increasing delivery risks or impacting the environment. We're also working with the MDBA and other states on a joint program of work to increase our understanding of the risks, mitigate them where we can, and have clear plans in place to manage shortfalls when they occur. Like water availability risks, however, all water users are responsible for managing their own water delivery risks. And I mentioned I was going to touch on some of the information that's available to help with understanding this risk. The MDBA reports on current delivery risks in its weekly reports and through its annual operating outlook released early each water year. If a shortfall were to occur, Victorian authorities would seek to mitigate delivery risks and minimise the need to ration water users. If required, rationing would occur in proportion to users' extraction rights. And importantly, Lower Murray Water and Goulburn Murray Water will communicate with water users about what a shortfall means for you, should it occur. I'll leave you now with these links to further information on delivery risks, which I understand are also being shared in the chat. And Joe and I are also happy to pick up on anything I've touched on in this presentation during the Q&A. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, James. Okay, we've reached the question and answer section of our discussion. So thank you to those who have been putting questions in the chat while the presentations have been running. There's still opportunity to do that. So if you've got anything that you would like to know, please go to that Q&A function and pop your questions in there, and we'll get to as many as we can. And also just want to highlight that while we've been listening to the presentations, Amanda has been busily putting all the different links to the different reports in the chat function. So if you click on the chat, you should be able to see the location of the different reports that have been referenced throughout the presentations. And I also want to make it clear, sorry, I was going to do this as part of the introduction, but forgot, that this webinar is being recorded. And so a copy of the recording will be sent to everybody that's registered for the webinar today. And it will also be available on the AgVic Extension Oz Irrigating Agriculture website, hopefully by tomorrow, if we can get it up and running by then. So yes, so this recording will be available for others if they wish to watch it at a later date. All right, so we'll kick off now with the questions. So the first one I've got is for you, Ben. What is AWEP, and was this factored into the supply and demand report?
Yeah, okay. So AWEP is the Aboriginal Water Entitlements Program. It's a Commonwealth program that was announced back in, I think it was 2018, by the then minister. No, it's not included in our analysis, and the reason for that is that the water recovered or water bought by the AWEP program remains in the consumptive pool. So the intention of that program is that the Commonwealth is purchasing it on behalf of Basin First Nations, and that water will be returned to First Nations to do with as they please.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. And while you're in the hot seat, I've had a couple come in around carryover. So the first one is how was or why wasn't carryover considered as part of the analysis in the report?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, carryover is certainly a very important risk mitigation tool for participants. It's very, very difficult to model, and on balance, we decided that it was too difficult to model in the context of this report, which has been the approach to carryover and intervalley trade since the first report. Rajiv, yep. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, not too much more. Yeah, it carries inherent complexities and a a person's decision to carry over into the following year is governed by a range of factors, and you also have things like risk of spill as well. So, for the sake of simplicity and also for ease of comparability with the previous reports, we decided to stick with the assumption. Certainly, we're always looking for ways to improve. So, whether we include it in the next report is certainly something we'll think about.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think this one might be slightly related, but so feel free, we'll see how we go. Is it possible to factor in the role of carryover from one season to the next, appreciating that this would be highly variable and hard to predict? Is that the same sort of answer, Ben, or is there something else you can kind of add on that one?
I mean, it'd be wonderful to be able to do it, and you could do it, but I'm just not sure that that Joe and their team would be willing to foot the bill for the modelling required to do so.
Yes.
And just something that might be useful for the audience, what you could do is there's certainly a lot of appendices that sit within the report with a lot of the granular data. So attendees can pour over the data if they wish and apply their own assumptions of carryover volumes to inform their own judgment. So that data is there in the appendices of the report.
Excellent. Thank you. And Joe got his hand up. Do you want to add anything to that one, Joe?
Just jump in briefly to add as well. Again, there is a lot of information on the Water Register website about water available in a given year, where people can see how much is carried over in a given year from one year to next. As Reggie and Ben have said, it's very hard to predict how individuals will behave. But in the long run, we have seen people using it, obviously, to, I guess, carry over water from some of the wetter years to smooth out some of the troughs in the dry years. So there is certainly some information there on the Water Register website, but it's something we're keen for people to think about themselves as well, on how they might use carryover and how they might have observed others using carryover at the system level. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Ben, another one for you. Do you conduct any retrospective analysis on the previous projections to determine how accurate they were against the actual outcomes? And if so, how reliable have they been?
That's a good question. Yes, we do, and yes, it's that analysis is actually included in the report. One of the key takeouts is, and Rajiv kind of spoke to this in his part of the presentation today, there was a significant change in what we had been told by market participants and industry experts in our interviews and data collection for the 2022 report, which predicted quite or suggested quite aggressive growth in future developments. Now that didn't come to pass for various reasons. We had increased record levels of increasing interest rates. We had issues with supply chain issues, commodity price issues across the board, including for almonds, which have now picked up. So yeah, there's a vast array of reasons as to why that part of the demand side was different to what was predicted. The projections for in the current report, looking forward for the next 3 to 5 years, are relatively modest by comparison, but are framed in what is happening right now in agricultural markets.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Now I'll give you a rest for a moment. And I'm gonna.
People want to hear from Joe. That's for
I know,
sure.
that's what I was going to say. The next one's for Joe. Joe, in the worst times, is there a mechanism for state governments? So I suppose in that extreme dry scenario, is there a mechanism for state governments to alter or change intervalley trade rules?
Thanks, Beck. I think what I'd say to that is certainly the key trade rules that Victoria will touch on already have some inbuilt mechanisms that potentially provide for a bit more trade in the driest years. the Barmer trade rule, which limits net trade from above to below the choke, does have a mechanism for on the MDBA's advice for governments to relax that trade rule in the driest years, which can be possible because there is, in the driest times, spare capacity to deliver water through Barmer because there's not as much water allocated, not as much water that can be delivered. And so the trade rule can be relaxed at certain times. And we certainly saw that through the Millennium Drought. That trade rule was open under that relaxation rule. So it's certainly not every year. The rule is there to manage the very real risks of delivery risks in the Lower Murray and environmental damage in the forest, but in the driest years, that's been relaxed in the past. Similarly, the Goulburn to Murray trade rule, it does have an aspect where in very dry years and low allocations in the Goulburn, the amount of annual trade that can happen to the Lower Murray does increase slightly. And that is because in those driest years, the amount the Goulburn owes to the Murray as a result of historical trades is less because Goulburn allocations are low. So to put that in a real example, I think this year there's been about 170 gigs of trade from the Goulburn to the Murray. The long run average, we've said in average years, is probably 130 to 150. So that extra 20 to 40 gigs is because it has been a dry year in the Goulburn and there's not as much water to deliver as there would have been historically. So there are some little mechanisms within there that certainly allow for more flexibility in those two key trade rules.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Now, Ben, back to you. This is a good question, actually. The presentation showed that water availability for permanent horticulture, so the focus of the presentation was on permanent horticulture. What assumptions do these figures include for water use by other industries, for example, dairy? And is the assumption that water will be redirected from other industries to cover the shortfall in horticulture during dry years? And what are some of the restrictions around that? That's a tricky question, that one, but
it is and it isn't. So
yep.
So the report looks at permanent horticultural supply, at demand and supply versus supply. So the assumption is that that all available water would go to permanent horticulture in any given year. Now, of course, that's not reality, but industries like dairy, who have substitutes for the use of water, i.e., bringing in grain or fodder, can take decisions on a year-by-year basis, whereas permanent horticulture has a more fixed level of demand, which is the purpose of the report.
Excellent. Thank you. Joe, do you have anything to add on that, or that makes sense? Nothing else from a DEECA point of view?
No, I don't think so. This may touch slightly on one of the later questions as well, and probably as Ben's touched on. People in other commodities will make their own decisions about whether to buy and sell in those dry seasons. As Ben says, many of the economic drivers are for perennial horticultural plantings to be buyers. Many others will have the flexibility to make decisions to sell, but each business is different. They may not choose to sell in those situations.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you. So, Joe, this is another one for yourself. And it kind of leads on from that last question. So issues with the choke and the ability to be able to get water down the Goulburn without environmental damage. How does that factor into those considerations?
I think, and Ben and Rajiv step in if you like, that I guess one critical point of this report is just looking at water availability in the Lower Murray itself and demand.
Yep.
So that's demand and entitlements that are already downstream of those key points. So in some ways, it's isolating the existing issues there already, and then anything more that can come through under either existing trade rules or that additional flexibility you can get in dry years will, I guess, assist in increasing the water that's available. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Another one for you, Ben. Why hasn't the Murrumbidgee been included in the analysis report?
Another good question, and it kind of goes to what we were just talking about there. We haven't considered. Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is this report was commissioned by the Victorian government, and therefore it is focused on the systems within Victoria, which don't include the Murrumbidgee, notwithstanding there is connectivity between the Murrumbidgee and the Murray. But for the simplicity of analysis, we have assumed that, or we haven't considered any intervalley trade from a supply perspective. Now, obviously, that will vary from year to year, and will certainly provide additional water for the Lower Murray in years where the demand in the Lower Murray requires it. But it is it's a little bit like carryover in that there's individual decisions that need to be factored in modelling, and it becomes far too complex to be able to accurately model and compare to past reports.
Excellent, thank you. I've got another one here, which I think might be a bit similar to maybe one of the ones you've answered previously, but we'll see. So the analysis compares hort demand to total water availability. In the real world, the deficit in dry periods will depend heavily on the preparedness of non-hort water users to trade. So have you considered how this will impact on the hort deficits?
It's a great point, and it kind of goes to what Joe was saying before. It's something that we saw in, and I'm stretching my memory here, but I think it was 2019. The cotton price was quite healthy that year, and what we saw was cotton really competing quite heavily with permanent hort, and actually outpaying them in a lot of instances. So it is definitely possible that that annual crops compete or don't give up their water to permanent horticulture in dry conditions because of the different economic considerations that they have at a farm by farm level. Again, very difficult for us to model that, and so from the perspective of simplicity and comparability, we've assumed that all the water goes to permanent horticulture. Now, what does that mean for the second part of the question there? What does that mean for permanent hort? Well, if you have healthy annual crop prices and annual croppers competing against permanent horticulture, then that is likely to reduce the amount of water that is available for permanent horticulture, and reduce the headroom in any given year that our analysis shows.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Now I might introduce a new person to the webinar, because we've had a question come through around buybacks. So I'll introduce Jen Learmonth to the discussion. So Jen is a water policy person with water and catchments. So Jen, the question for you is, what is the government doing to prevent further buybacks?
Thanks, Beck. Just to be clear, the Victorian government does not support the Australian government's voluntary water purchase program that it's currently undertaking in the Southern Connector Basin. This program has and continues to cause significant socioeconomic impacts across communities and across the basin as a whole. Unfortunately, we can't stop them. In 2024, we did release the Planning Our Basin Future Together prospectus, which sets out a method and a way to conduct water recovery for the environment that holds community really closely into that project and has high levels of consultation to try and minimise those socioeconomic impacts. So we keep on advocating for this work to be taken up by the Australian government, but unfortunately at the moment we cannot stop the purchases that are happening.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so we're starting to get to the end of our question and answer session. So if you've got any last ones you would like to pop into the Q&A function, please do so. And thank you already to we've had a great response and lots and lots of questions coming through. I've got one here, which I think might be for either Ben or probably Ben or Joe. Can you unpack the details underpinning the assumptions that future Commonwealth recovery water will be undertaken in proportions matching the current e-water holdings?
Yeah, that's one for us. That
Yep.
that was one of our assumptions within the report. Look, the answer is we don't know what the Commonwealth will do in terms of where they'll purchase or the types of entitlements that they'll purchase. And so to do the analysis, we had to make some assumptions which are included in the back of the report, and I did run through today. But we thought it was the most reasonable assumption would be that future purchases would be proportionate to the current tube portfolio. And we actually checked that assumption with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder as well, and they thought that was a reasonable assumption to make, so we went forward with it.
Okay, and I think I've got probably time
Sorry,
for
Beck,
one.
can I just
Oh, go. Yeah, of course you can, Jen. Go
add
for it.
in a little bit of information there. The current water purchases to date, so the report only goes back to the 30th of June last year, but the current water purchases right till now has about 41% of the water purchases coming from Victoria, with slightly more coming from New South Wales and a small portion from South Australia. Now, that isn't necessarily maintaining that tube portfolio ratio that was assumed in the report. But the thing that people need to consider with this as well is we are looking across the whole of the Southern Basin with this report. So what portion comes from Victoria versus New South Wales, while it will have a slight impact, we are looking across all of the states. So this report isn't just focused on Victoria.
Excellent. Thanks for clarifying that one, Jen. All right, I reckon we've got time for one more before we start to wrap up the session. Ben, this one's for you. Hopefully it's a pretty straightforward one. Have you made assumptions about the SIDLAM shortfalls as part of your analysis for the report?
That's an easy one. No, we haven't. Yeah, we recognise that there's potential for a significant shortfall, but there's no indication from the Commonwealth as to how that shortfall would be met. So we haven't included that at all.
Excellent. All right, we might be able to squeeze one more in. I think another question has just come through for Jen. This one is, could the Vic government simply not agree or refuse to have prospective water entitlements transferred to the Commonwealth government? You know, is that something that could happen, Jen?
No, it's not, unfortunately. So Joe might be able to come in with a better answer than me on this one, but there are rules that govern the water market around not refusing trade to people based on who they are or who they might be, in terms of making it a fair playing field for everyone. So we cannot refuse a trade of water simply because it's going to the Commonwealth.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. I'm just doing a final scan of I think we've just about run out of time for the questions. And I think we managed to hit on a large number of them. So thank you very much to everybody for popping those ones into the chat, into the Q&A, sorry. So now we will just wrap up the session. I'd really like to thank Ben, Rajiv, Joe and James for their presentations today. I think, yeah, very, very informative, very timely, and yeah, great to see that this work is continuing on. And as we get more information and we get, I suppose, better clarity around what is actually happening with some of the developments in the horticultural sector, that, you know, we're continually updating this information, which I think is fantastic. As I said earlier, this recording has been recorded, so we will be sending out a link to everybody in the chat following this session. I mean, via email. Sorry, I've got chats and Q&As on the mind here, but it will be sent out to everybody via email following this session, and we'll have it up on the Extension Oz website. In the chat here, there is links to all of the different reports that have been referred to, but most importantly, the supply and demand in the water supply and demand in the southern Murray-Darling Basin updated report is now available on the Victorian Water Register website. And we will also have a link. There's a survey that you'll be asked to fill in as you're exiting the webinar, that just provides a little bit of feedback on the session and also gives us an idea of any other topics that you might be interested in learning more about in the future. So if you could take a moment or two just to fill that in, that would be really appreciated by those of us that organised this one. So yeah, thank you again to everyone for attending. We've had a really, really great turnout, I think, again, supporting the fact that this is really important information coming at a really, really great time. So thank you, everybody, and I'll call the webinar to a close. Thank you.